What is up, guys? Have a new video for you today. It is a new series that is a discussion based. I realize in my videos that I want to talk about these sorts of things, but I can't because I'm trying to give commentary on the game that I'm playing and strategies and tips and that sort of thing. So I decided to make a different series where I can just solely focus on talking about all this stuff that I've wanted to. For the first episode, I thought I'd talk about a new macro strategy, thing that I've realized that as GWENT is transformed into in general. And so by macro, I have these things I call macro and then micro. So macro is things like red coin, blue coin, round length, do you bleed, etc., etc. Like the big kind of general strategy stuff that you realize. And then micro is, oh, he's played this card, how do I respond to it? That's the general idea how I break down macro and micro. And so a macro thing I've noticed that I'm going to discuss is bleeding. Now, when I first started playing GWENT, it was typically you played round 1, whoever won, dry pass round 2, meaning didn't play card, you just instantly pass, and you each went into about a 10 card round 3, and then just decked it out there. That is how it was played like 90% of the games. Bleeds were very rare. Very rare. Monsters would do it sometimes, I guess, but hardly ever encountered it. That could have been affected by things like rank and stuff, but even when I got up to the higher ranks and pro ranks, that was typically the case. But now recently, I'd probably say after Way of the Witcher, maybe a little bit before then, but definitely after, bleeding has become the new meta, where everyone is so afraid of each other's long rounds because some decks' long rounds are just crazy, stupid, high point ceilings. They have that, I should say, that you just don't want to deal with it. You can't go against it because you're really afraid of certain cards. Like, you see Nilfgaard, balls in there. You don't want to go against a long round 10 with Nilfgaard because if they're doing a simulate, they already get over 100 points from that. They're playing your engines, get rewarded from it. And then they drop ball towards the end, and then they just wipe out any of your good plays. Crazy amount of points. You don't want against that, so you bleed. And there's two sides to this I want to discuss. I think, for the first thing, it's interesting that GWENT has got to that level where some of these cards have such high point ceilings, definitely scenarios, probably the biggest culprits of that, that it's just too scary to go against. And you're going to bleed out because you have to flush that card out because there's a very good chance if you adequately, can't talk there, if you adequately know your deck and you know pretty much what your opponent's playing, that you can't beat it, your option is to bleed. That's about the only way you can take it back. And I'd say when cards get about 11 to 12 provisions, their point ceilings are just crazy high in many cases. But there's a lot of 10 ones, too, that are the cases. Like, you think, oh man, where is it? You think, like, an unanswered, like, Draco Turtle, that can be crazy high. And I was looking for Koshji. Yeah, there it is. Koshji's, phenomenal in a short round, too. But, like, this deck easily gets you over 100 points, like, et cetera, et cetera. And so people don't want to deal with it, and they want to bleed. And so the discussion turns to, well, is that fine? Do we want it to be this way? Should some of these cards with these high provisions, whose ceiling is just so crazy high, do they need to be tuned a bit? And I think we might touch on that in a later episode, because I want to keep it focusing on bleeding here. And so the second thing is that you can't just bleed, though. And that's an issue that I see, is people that it's just in their nature now where they bleed you and you're like, what are you doing? You won round 1. You want the long round, right? Like if Assimilate, Ball, whatever, wins that round 1, they should go to the long round. And that's not exactly the best example because they can do fine in a short round. But I see these cards, these decks are going in and they just instantly bleed. And I'm playing monsters, but not only that, Force of Nature or like Fruits of Isgith, even Arrakis Swarm, you don't want to bleed those decks because they'll survive that bleed and they'll have a better short round than you. Furthermore, people are only bleeding with bronzes. Like, if you're going to bleed, you have to commit good cards that are actually going to flush out an appropriate response from your opponent, right? That's why one of the best bleeding cards, and the kind of one that was doing it for the longest time, was Caltolus, because Caltolus required big responses and could flush out quite a bit from your opponent, where then you could pass and be fine. Like Caltolus and Nithral going off, that's an effective bleed. Then later on, you had things like Ozril or whatever to get a lot of points in a short round. So if you are going to bleed, make sure you have the deck for it, and then make sure that you're going to commit cards. Furthermore, I also expect now that because bleeding is becoming the new, macro strategy, make sure you start deck building accordingly, that you don't only go in with cards that have high payoff after long rounds, cards that are just good points. I wouldn't be surprised maybe we start seeing Great Oak show up a little bit more from that, because it's just nice points short round. But that's why a lot of these, like Jacques is always thrown in to syndicate decks, because it's good points in short round, but then it's also a spender. So I guess the last thing I want to touch on with this is that I do think this has become the new macro. I think bleeding is everywhere. I think the cause of that is because some decks long rounds are too scared. So if the opponent gets round control, of course they're going to bleed, because they just don't want to go against ball, etc., etc. And then the other thing is that if you are going to bleed, please make sure you have the faction or the deck for it. Don't just bleed with bronzes, because it's not going to work for you. Your opponent's going to take a card and you're done. Now, I've been guilty of that, where I try and hang on to some really good cards and just hope for the best, but I lose a card, and it just doesn't matter. Because unless you're willing to commit good cards, your opponent's probably not going to play theirs. And then the final kind of thought here is probably what might lead into next week's discussion is how has GWENT got to this state? And I think it's just some cards are just too strong and just too problematic. And key examples of that are like Visigoda, Ball. You'd even think like old school like Kikimore Queen or Old Harmony, but that's not it's not the current state. It's just an example of cards that are just too crazy strong, like Herald in a long run, really scary. And so maybe some tuning things that should be done, like 4 provision cards, they get their value. 5 provision slot is pretty weak now, and then they've buffed some of the lower tier golds, but then they all kind of hit around their provision thing. And then when you get up to these higher cards, they're just hitting so far above their provision count, can be so many points that it's insane. So you see deck building now is you're stacking like 2 13 provisions, a bunch of 11s, couple 10s. Then you play like almost no lower tier gold cards, like no 5p, and then you have like 8 or 9 4 provision cards. It's crazy. It's how like Northern Realms decks look. So, yeah. So I hope that gave a little bit of overview of kind of what I think and what I'm seeing. Given the causes for it, we'll talk about maybe how to fix that, and then just for the tip side of this is just what you need to do because this is now the macro. This is what you got to consider. So make sure you have cards that are good for bleeding. Make sure you have good cards that are good for short round. So I hope that wasn't too rambling. I hope that maybe gave you guys a little bit to think about and ponder over. Let me know if you see that. Maybe it's just me, but I definitely do see bleeding left, right, and center, whereas before it was hardly at all. So yeah, there it is. Let me know if you guys have any recommendations, any things you'd like me to talk about, and I will catch you in the next one.